They say histories are written in triumphal arches and public laws, but sometimes they are traced most faithfully in the whispering piles of correspondence, in the scorch marks of bonfires that consumed inconvenient names, and in the furtive marks carved into the undersides of tables where promises were bought and sold. The second act of Messalina's reign unfolded not on the battle lines of empire, but in the secret ledgers and private rooms of an administration that preferred obedience to justice. The acts themselves, whatever their precise detail, mattered less than the architecture of power she had mastered, a system that transformed shame into a tool and silence into an instrument. Begin with the attendants. Every court requires hands to move its scenery, and Messalina cultivated a small, fierce core who understood that servitude bound by fear was also protection. They kept lists, whispered names into the hush of linened chambers, and kept watch between plinths of marble where once the state stored its dignity. These women recorded transgressions in ciphered ink, a gesture here, a disoriented departure there, a ledger noting time and place as if the city's moral ledger itself could be itemized and pawned. To hold someone's secret in Rome was, in effect, to hold the rope with which their career might be pulled or strangled. She made the knowledge a private disgrace, portable and profitable. Governorships changed hands. Contracts were suddenly convenient. Rivals who had once been dangerous were now purchasable by silence. The imperial brothel, by the time the accounts reach us, was less a den of base lust than a bureaucratic engine. Noble wives were led not merely to be taken, but to be documented. Who left with what look in their eyes? Who gained a blush that would not wash away? Those data points became a form of currency. A favored general who had once commanded respect found himself offered an easy consulship in exchange for a discretion that cost him honor. The men who survived Messalina's tables did so not because they were morally pure. They survived because they learned to trade a moment of degradation for the long-term safety of name and family. She taught the elite a new arithmetic. A knight's shame counted as wealth, and wealth counted for new rules. The Senate, the supposed fulcrum of Roman restraint, oscillated between outrage and impotence. At first, there was indignation that could be performed with dramatic flourish, a statement issued in the cool light of the Curia, a wax tablet thrust in front of a senator for the sake of optics. But these gestures mattered less than the unseen pressure the empress could bring to bear. The majority of magistrates were men with property to lose and clients to protect. Political life in Rome ran on mutual vulnerability. Messalina supplied a new currency of mutual ruin. As people found their names in sealed scrolls, as reputations were quietly shredded in the privacy of her villa, the willingness to act in public staggered. What remained of the Senate's authority turned inward, legal motions, posturing, essays. But the muscle to follow through, to pursue prosecution without fear, withered under the knowledge that any prosecutor could be the next exhibit. Outside the marble precincts, the story was no less corrosive. Governors in Africa and Asia received dispatches flavored with threat: accept the recommendation of a new procurator, or find your harvest is skewed by imperial favor. Merchants who once paid tribute with routine predictability now found the court's appetite for darker gains edging into trade. Diplomatic missions were no longer about treaties, but about whether envoy wives could be spared from attentions foreign courts could not resist invoking when bargaining over grain and armor. The empire's external policy bent under the subtlety of domestic extortion. Rome's enemies might still have feared its legions, but they now watched an internal rut whose tendrils reached into negotiating rooms and naval manifests alike. For the soldiers and the praetorians, whose loyalty armed and sustained the palace, discontent brewed differently. The army, built upon a fragile mixture of pride and patronage, could not long tolerate the insinuation that one's comrades had been made to perform humiliations in the name of courtly pleasure. Murmurs that once would have ended in a clash of swords took to shape of whispered lists. Which centurion had been compromised, which company commander's honor had been bartered. The barracks are a world apart from the drawing rooms of the elite, and the cracks between them widen quickly when honor is weaponized. The guard that had once sworn to protect the emperor began to measure loyalty against fear, and fear, as it turns inward, becomes the seed of conspiracy. Messalina's theater of power achieved something greater than any single triumph of lust or spectacle. It made the private public and the public private. She rewrote the grammar of shame. In one of the most chilling consequences, marriage, an institution whose formality once secured familial alliances and legal rights, inverted into a currency controlled by the throne. Private vows meant less than palatine whim. The civil processes that once underpinned Roman family law were repurposed for the benefit of the court. The marriage she staged to her lover was not simply an act of audacity. It was a declaration that the old order had been suspended, that ceremonial consent could be re-engineered so long as the palace proclaimed it so. It was both a gamble and a provocation, and it revealed the fatal miscalculation at the heart of her power. Spectacle can bind attention, but cannot forever bind allegiance. There is a perversity in how rumors construct their own reality. Once an elite rumor becomes widely believed, the empire begins to live it. Messalina's excesses, whether embroidered by satirists or faithfully recorded by chroniclers with access to grind, became an economic engine of narrative. Poets and pamphleteers circulated tales that were both condemnation and commodity. The city that traded in marble and grain traded also in story. The stories of humiliation turned into gossip that knit neighborhoods into shared outrage. Public moralizing, sermons from the steps, whispered admonitions at the market, carried a different tone when people suspected that the person preaching had himself been compromised. Preach too loudly, and there would be a ledger to reveal the preacher's private failings. This was the precise tyranny of the system. No moral authority could be assumed. Every public stand carried private risk. Consider the mechanics of memory. Statues were toppled, inscriptions erased, names damned to oblivion with official censors' tools. Yet memory has a stubborn, often perverse life. The attempt to obliterate Messalina's name only made her spectral. Absence, after all, invites curiosity. Where the state engineered damnatio memoriae, erasures that sought to remove a person's imprint, the public imagination often fills the blanks with rumor more vivid than reality. Thus, the ruin of her statues fed the rumor mill. A blank pedestal becomes an invitation to invention. The very laws meant to excise scandal transformed the story into lore. And there is the deeper argument about the limits of monarchy and the dangers of concentrated sanctity. Rome's political theology had, over generations, elevated the princeps towards semi-divine status. When the mantle of sacred authority touched a personality hungry for domination, religious practice itself could be bent into grotesque parody. The sacramental language that once conferred civic solidarity became a mask for coercion. The guards of temples, the keepers of ritual propriety, were pushed into complicity when the altar itself became a stage for humiliation. Yet the end arrived not because the heavens intervened, but because the practicalities of politics and fear finally reached a point of rupture. Power built on terror must maintain ever more terror to survive, and terror is expensive. The equilibrium becomes impossible to sustain when the very actors whose obedience is required can calculate a better future in removing the tyrant. The moment Messalina overplayed her hand, when the marriage to another man was staged as an open provocation, it crystallized opposition into decision. What had been a network of private compromises hardened into a conspiracy. The freedmen and officials who once sold silence now counted the cost of an empire destabilized by scandal. It took a handful of determined men, a blade, and the weight of public, if muted, consent to bring the theater down. But history's lesson is not only about those final blades. The aftermath was not neat. The political removal of Messalina did not immediately restore moral clarity. Clodius's decrees could punish a body and erase a name, but the private ledger of humiliations had already altered the course of careers and lineage. Families rebuilt themselves around new alliances born of forced compromises. Governors installed through blackmail did not all vanish with the Empress. The legal architecture that enabled such abuses, secrecy, the centralization of honor in the person of the sovereign, the informal economy of favors, remained. It took generations for institutions to reassert a public logic that distinguished obligation from exploitation. Perhaps the most sobering legacy of her story is a cultural one, the way a single person's appetite can expose the fissures of civic life. The tragedy is not merely that one ruler transgressed, it is that an entire social system could be so easily repurposed. Messalina's tale is therefore a twofold admonition: against granting absolute authority without checks, and against letting private vice become the lever by which public policy is decided. Her life warns that when the public and private collapse into one another, the republic rots from within, and even the greatest institutions, law, religion, family, can be harnessed to ruin. And yet, as the centuries passed and the tales grew, a curious ambivalence remained. Some remembered Messalina as a monstrous manipulator, others as a woman who briefly seized the one power available to her in a world that rarely allowed women real political agency. The line between criminal and strategist narrowed in the retelling. That moral ambiguity is where Messalina's story retains its grip. Not as a tidy parable where vice is vanquished and virtue restored, but as a mirror that returns an image of a city willing to barter dignity for stability. Walk through the Palatine ruins at dusk and listen closely. There is no chorus of absolution, only the noise of history's sediment. Footfalls on cracked marble, the whisper of wind through toppled columns, the faint echo of festival songs that once promised renewal. The Roman experiment in concentrated majesty produced breathless splendor and, at its margins, obscene cruelty. Messalina's life, however embellished or excoriated by annalists, remains a study in how intimacy, when wielded as power, can turn the humane into the instrumental. Her story is not merely the anatomy of scandal, it is a warning about the fragility of civic bonds when the private realm becomes the theater of politics. In the end, the city survived, for a while longer, not because its laws were flawless, but because human networks are stubbornly resilient. They rebuild, retell, and reframe. But the price was tallied in the slow corrosion of trust. Trust between rulers and ruled, between husband and wife, between priest and parishioner. Messalina's age teaches that ruin is not always loud. Sometimes it is quieter, encoded in the ledger's silence, and in the uncomfortable knowledge that what an empire permits in its private rooms sooner or later decides what it will allow in its public life. So the question that lingers in the Palatine shadows is not only who she was, but what a society becomes when it allows one of its members to convert shame into leverage and fear into policy. The answer is visible not in a single scandal, but in the slow realignment of an empire's soul. And that is why the story of Valeria Messalina endures, because it is, at once, a spectacle of human vice and a sober lesson in political hygiene. A reminder that empires may fall by the sword, but they can be hollowed by the private appetites of those placed above the law.